Today we're going to be discussing about learning and memory. So learning is basically the process by which changes in behavior occur due to experiences interacting with the environment. So there are two types of learning, associative and non-associative. Here we're discussing non-associative learning. So non-associative learning, firstly we have habituation. So habituation basically a decrease in the strength or frequency of a behavior after repeated exposure to a stimulus. So that is habituation. And second one is sensitization, an increase in behavioral response following repeated exposure to a stimulus. Increase in behavioral response following repeated exposure to stimulus. Now, conceptual approaches to learning memory. There are four conceptual approaches. Firstly, we have functional approach. Then we have behavioral. Thirdly, we have cognitive. And finally, fourthly, we have a neuroscience approach. So, functional approach studies the purpose of learning and memory from an adaptive or survival perspective. Behavioral approach focuses on observable behaviors and then modification through reinforcement or punishment. Cognitive approach examines internal processes like attention, perception, and memory. While neuroscience approach investigates the neural mechanisms underlying learning and memory, often using brain imaging or electrophysiological techniques. Now, elicited behavior. So this is basically the behavior when we hit, let's say, a knee with a rubber hammer and how the reflex action occurs. So this is the mechanism of that. So mechanical force-induced stretch is basically what we're talking about. So firstly, we hit our let's say knee with a rubber hammer. So that stimulates our tactile sensory stimulus, which in turn causes the stretch receptors to receive neurons. Then we have action potential. It travels through neurons to cell body of motor neurons. So this is basically some class note that you can go through. This is just a very brief version. I'll discuss in detail what is occurring below. So what now we just like this I'll come back to later. Right now we'll be discussing reflexes. So definition: reflexes are innate, automatic, and fast responses to specific environmental stimuli that require minimal neural processing. So they are innate, automatic, and fast responses to environmental stimuli that require minimal neural processing. Now characteristics: they require minimal cognitive effort, depend on innate mechanisms rather than prior experience, and enable the brain to allocate resources to higher mental functions. Now, reflex is basically innate behavior, require minimal processing, not much dependent on experience, automatic and fast, ability to respond to environmental stimuli quickly, allows brain to deal with higher mental functions. Now, example: mechanical force induces stress reflex, a classic example of elicited behavior. So we come to these class notes later and move on to habituation. So habituation is a form of non-associative learning where the strength or frequency of a behavioral response decreases after repeated exposure to a stimulus. So basically, the concepts involved are Sokolov's model. So Sokolov model basically explains habituation as the brain's reduced response to repetitive stimuli due to a mismatch between stimulus and the internal representation. Now, applications: cognitive approach examines how repeated exposure to stimuli reduces behavioral and neural responses. Now, experimental studies of habituation. Firstly, we'll be discussing on animals. So, acoustic subtle reflex: short-term habituation, decreased response within a single session of repeated exposure, and long-term habituation, persistence of reduced response across sessions. Now, human studies. Firstly, we'll be talking about eye blink reflex. So, the eye blink reflex measures waveform amplitude and peak time. Bradley and Saltinelli showed habituation using blink reflexes. Then we have IR eye tracking, tracks orienting responses to familiar old versus novel new faces. Habituated faces elicit weaker responses than novel faces. Then we have electrodermal activity, EDA. So it measures skin conductance as an inductor of arousal. Habituation is observed as a decrease in EDA responses over repeated exposure. Resilience and affective traits examines how individual differences in resilience affect habituation patterns. Now, factors influencing habituation. So there are mainly five factors. First is salience or intensity of the stimulus. Less arousing stimuli leads to faster habituation. Stronger stimuli take longer to habituate. Second, we have timing of exposures, masked and spaced. So masked exposures are basically shorter interstimulus intervals, which are basically placed together in time temporally. So shorter interstimulus intervals result in faster habituation, but may not last as long. While spaced exposures are spaced out in time, so they have fewer habituation, but the effects are more enduring because they last longer since they have been placed at different times temporally. Right. Now, third, we have stimulus specificity. Habituation is stimulus specific. Different stimulus may not elicit the same response decrement. Now, stimulus generalization. A similar but distinct stimulus may cause partial habituation. Spontaneous recovery. The habituated response can reappear after a period without exposure to the stimulus. And this habituation, renewed response to a previously habituated stimulus after the introduction of a novel stimulus. Now, applications of habituation research, UX design, and cognitive measures. So, in UX design, estimating culture-specific habituation durations to customize visual or auditory stimuli in advertising. Designing interfaces that consider habituation to ensure sustained user engagement. Cognitive measures, using habituation patterns as objective measures of attention, memory, and other cognitive functions. Now, learning and habituation, their relationships. So, increase in learning is basically increase in habituation, which is decrease in response. So, as the learning of an individual progresses, adds to repetitive stimuli, leading to reduced response over time. So, basically, an example could be habituating to the sound of a ticking clock in the background. Now, habituation in caffeine versus placebo. So, caffeine and placebo, there was an experiment conducted. So, habituation is lower in caffeine because caffeine stimulates the nervous system, making it harder to adapt to stimuli. The graph for response reduction decreases more gradually. So, it is slower in the case of caffeine. And placebo, habituation is faster because there's no external stimulant affecting the nervous system. So the graph for placebo habituation is basically shows a steeper decline in response over time. Now moving on to galvanic skin response, GSR, and correlation analysis. So GSR basically measures changes in the skin's electrical conductivity due to sweat gland activity, often used to assess arousal or habituation. Detection: GSR increases when the individual is exposed to a novel or intense stimulus. Over time, habituation to the stimulus reduces GSR amplitudes. Now, R, correlation coefficient, is a statistical measure that quantifies the strength and direction of a linear relationship between two variables. Values range from -1 perfect negative correlation to +1 perfect positive correlation, with 0 indicating no correlation. Interpretation: tighter fit to line of best fit, stronger correlation, and an inverse proportion, a negative correlation where an increase in one variable corresponds to a decrease in another. Now, slope of linear regression, used to compare relationships across datasets, a negative slope basically suggests a negative correlation. Moving on to p-value. P-value is basically the probability that the observed correlation is due to chance. At alpha level, the threshold for statistical significance, commonly set at 0.005, 0.05, sorry. So p-value less than alpha level indicates a significant relationship. Now, resilience, effective traits, and habituation. So, resilience and effective traits. Greater resilience is equal to lesser effective traits. So, greater resilience corresponds to lesser effective traits in individuals. High resilience individuals are less emotionally reactive and show faster habituation, leading to lesser effective traits. While low resilience is equal to high response amplitude plus more effective traits. So low resilience individuals exhibit heightened emotional responses and slower habituation. For example, they may experience prolonged physiological arousal. Example, high GSR after repeated stimuli. Now, habituation patterns. High resilience individuals adapt quickly to repetitive stimuli, reducing their response amplitude over time. Low resilience individuals, however, take longer to habituate, maintaining elevated responses. Now, masked versus spaced stimuli in habituation and forgetting. So, masked stimuli definition: stimuli presented at shorter intervals, rapid repetitions. So, habituation faster because the nervous system is exposed to consistent and repetitive input with minimum recovery time. Forgetting is slower due to the continuous exposure, reinforcing the memory tricks. Example: repeated practice of a skill in quick succession leads to faster short-term habituation but reduced long-term retention. While spaced stimuli is basically presented with longer intervals between repetitions. Now, habituation is slower because recovery time between stimuli allows for more distinct processing of each exposure. Forgetting faster because the intervals between exposures weaken the memory trace. Example: studying with long breaks between sessions leads to slower habituation but better long-term memory consolidation. Right. Now, summary is basically learning and habituation. Increased learning leads to faster habituation and reduced response. Stimulus timing: mass stimulus leads to rapid habituation but slower forgetting, and space stimuli leads to slower habituation but better long-term retention. Physiological measures: GSR and resilience provide objective insights into these emotional and habituation responses. High resilience individuals adapt quickly, while low resilience individuals exhibit prolonged responses. So that's it for the video, and thank you guys for watching.